Winter, 1988. A snowy air defense station near Irkutsk. Inside the thick concrete walls of Soviet PVO Command Post 37 radar consoles hum quietly beneath flickering fluorescent lights. The night shift is slow, the operators are bored. But then nothing. That's the problem. An unscheduled US B-52 penetration simulation begins. Soviet radar arrays across the Far East flicker to life, scanning for Tomahawk-class missiles. All eyes watch for any blip, any sign of movement near the theoretical vector of approach. Nothing. 15 minutes later, a red phone rings. It's a test result from the Strategic Rocket Forces. All Soviet simulation targets have been destroyed in the mock scenario. Destroyed by missiles that were never seen. No radar track, no flight detection, no infrared plumes. It wasn't a jamming exercise. There was no ECM. There were simply no returns, but the targets were hit regardless. One officer whispers the unthinkable. It's already operational. Across the Soviet Defense Ministry, confusion spreads. They scramble to determine what missile could fly this deep, this silently, this accurately. Then comes a single designation from an intercepted Western document, AGM-129 ACM. The name means little to the command staff, but in the halls of Soviet aerospace analysis, it lands like a thunderclap, a stealth cruise missile, nuclear-capable, subsonic, with extreme range. And worst of all, invisible, not hypothetical, not on paper, already deployed. By the time Soviet defense officials pieced together the timeline, they realized the truth. The Americans hadn't just built a better cruise missile. They'd built a weapon system designed from the ground up to evade the very thing the USSR depended on most, its air defense grid. And now, in the middle of a snow-covered night, staring at blank radar screens, Soviet commanders confront a terrifying new reality. They can't track what they can't see, and they can't stop what they can't track. For over 3 decades, the Soviet Union had invested more into air defense than any other nation on Earth. It was their pride, arguably more sophisticated than their nuclear arsenal. The PVO Protivo-Vozdushnaya Oborona was a separate branch of the military, dedicated entirely to shielding Soviet airspace from Western bombers and missiles. By 1988, the Soviet air defense system included over 10,000 surface-to-air missile systems, hundreds of long-range radar installations, a fleet of interceptor aircraft like the MiG-31 and Su-15, and a sprawling layered doctrine based on early detection and overwhelming response. This strategy worked against what they expected large American bombers like the B-52, subsonic cruise missiles like the original AGM-86. Even stealth aircraft, they believed, could be overwhelmed through radar density and multi-angle tracking. But those expectations came with assumptions. They believed that cruise missiles, no matter how stealthy, could never truly disappear from radar. They believed that low-altitude flight made them vulnerable to detection through ground-based systems. They believed their radar cross-section models were accurate. They believed they had time to intercept. They believed wrong. Because the AGM-129 changed the rules, it wasn't just smaller. It was shaped to bend radar around it, not reflect it. It flew at treetop level, curving along terrain features using digital maps. Its radar cross-section was less than 1/1000th that of a fighter jet in some bands. It registered as noise. Their doctrine was built to detect large, fast, and visible. The AGM-129 was small, slow, and invisible. The Soviets had assumed they could always at least see the threat. Maybe not stop it in time, but detect it, track it, now. That assumption was shattered, not by theory, not by rumors, but by an operational weapon already flying in test ranges beyond Soviet view. This wasn't a matter of catching up. It was a matter of being blind. And in war, blindness means death. Inside those radar rooms, once filled with absolute certainty, a new realization settled in. Their greatest strength, their impenetrable air defense network, had just become a billion-dollar illusion. The Soviet Union's air defense doctrine wasn't just extensive, It was obsessive. From the Cold War's earliest years, the USSR feared one thing above all American first-strike air power. In response, they constructed the largest integrated air defense network in human history. From Kaliningrad to Kamchatka, radar stations pulsed 24/7, feeding data into hardened bunkers where operators lived by the second. Every layer of their doctrine was designed to answer a question: how do we stop the bombers? The solution was depth and density, long-range detection, medium-range tracking, short-range interception, fighter command centers, semi-automated reaction loops, and SAM networks with overlapping fire zones. At the strategic level, the system was beautiful, redundant, robust, ruthless. And it worked. In the 1960s, they brought down Gary Powers' U-2. In the 1970s, they built the SA-5 and SA-10 to engage at extreme altitudes. By the 1980s, they claimed that no Western aircraft could penetrate Soviet airspace undetected. They had counted on this. It was doctrine, dogma, and deterrence. But that doctrine was never designed to handle what came next. A missile that wasn't detected at all. The AGM-129 didn't follow the path of a high-altitude bomber. It flew below radar, skimming forests, mountains, rivers. It didn't flash across a single sweep. It vanished beneath them. The missile's shape, a blended delta with forward-swept wings, was crafted with one goal: to bend radar away from itself, paired with RAM radar-absorbent material and a low thermal signature. It became almost invisible to X-band, L-band, and even UHF tracking arrays. The core of Soviet defense, the early warning radar net, was rendered useless, even more dangerous. The AGM-129 had range, over 700 kilometers. It didn't need to be launched near borders. It could fly from deep inside American or NATO airspace and strike without ever crossing into the radar's primary envelope. This broke more than doctrine. It broke timing. The Soviet system was built around reaction windows. If a bomber was spotted, they had minutes. If a cruise missile launched, they had to spot it within 60 seconds of flight. But with the AGM-129, there was no first contact. It was the nightmare scenario, an undetectable weapon carrying a nuclear payload arriving without warning. And there was no countermeasure. No SAM system could hit what it couldn't lock. No MiG could intercept what it couldn't track. And no bunker crew could authorize retaliation without detection. That single fact shattered the foundation of Soviet deterrence. Not because the weapon had been fired, but because the Soviets didn't know how to stop it, if it ever was. The event that shook Soviet confidence to its core didn't happen in combat. It happened during a classified simulation at a top-level air defense coordination center outside Moscow. It was mid-1989. NATO tensions were high, and Soviet generals ordered a comprehensive test of their interception network. The scenario: a surprise strike on critical infrastructure using advanced U.S. cruise missiles. To simulate realism, the Strategic Rocket Forces partnered with intelligence estimates of a new American system, the AGM-129. The parameters were chilling. In the simulation, 24 AGM-129s were launched from B-52 bombers flying well outside Soviet detection range. They entered Soviet airspace through multiple low-altitude corridors, flying under 100 meters, terrain masking active, stealth profile assumed. Within 17 minutes, 23 of the 24 targets hit their mark. Not one was detected by long-range radar. Not one triggered an air defense scramble. Only one missile, a simulation glitch, was spotted by a regional array in Novosibirsk. But by the time it was noticed, its theoretical warhead had already detonated. Command staff were stunned. The exercise was paused, then rerun with upgraded detection parameters. Same result. They reran it 3 more times, adjusted for radar frequency, adjusted for ground clutter filters, adjusted for AWACS support. Same result. Even with perfect coordination and maximum readiness, the simulated AGM-129 fleet flew unseen, unheard, and unstoppable. One major at the scene wrote in a private memo, "If this missile exists as advertised, we cannot defend the homeland." For Soviet military planners, this wasn't just a glitch in their doctrine, it was its funeral. The simulation exposed a fatal truth. The flight profile of the AGM-129 was outside the radar engagement envelope. Its RCS radar cross-section was too low for Soviet SAM guidance radars to acquire a lock, and its speed and terrain-following ability meant even passive acoustic or infrared sensors failed to spot it in time. After the simulation, several generals demanded a new round of funding for ultra-low-frequency radar systems and asymmetric response options. They were denied. Instead, a classified report was issued that buried the results under the phrase "highly unlikely threat scenario." But in the quiet corridors of the Soviet Air Defense Command, everyone knew better. This wasn't a hypothetical. It was a warning, a glimpse of how the next war would begin, and why the USSR might not see it coming until it was over. The simulation results reached the upper tiers of Soviet military leadership within 24 hours, and were immediately dismissed. The official stance from the Ministry of Defense was simple. Western stealth technology is exaggerated. AGM-129 is still in development. No weapon can be truly undetectable. To Moscow's political and military elite, the idea of a cruise missile bypassing their trillion-ruble air defense architecture was not just unacceptable, it was insulting. It contradicted everything they'd built. And so, they chose denial. Internal scientists who raised concerns were labeled alarmists. Reports from the simulation were edited before being archived. Briefings were reframed to highlight flaws in the exercise setup rather than the performance of the AGM-129. The reasoning was partly ideological. For decades, Soviet propaganda had boasted of impenetrable skies. Their air defense system wasn't just a military asset, it was a symbol of state power. To admit that a single subsonic missile could slip through that shield undetected would be to acknowledge strategic vulnerability, and the Soviet Union did not acknowledge weakness. A colonel from the Novosibirsk Air Defense District privately submitted a memo titled "Low RCS Threats and Terrain Masking: The End of Interception." It never reached his general. He was reassigned within weeks to a remote training base. Meanwhile, the KGB's scientific division quietly attempted to gather more intelligence on the AGM-129. But U.S. security around the missile was airtight. No photos, no launch telemetry, no leaks. The Americans, it seemed, understood the value of this ghost missile and protected it accordingly. Still, inside certain Soviet command circles, paranoia grew. If even 10% of the intelligence was true, if even half the simulations were accurate, then the USSR's entire air defense grid was obsolete without a single shot fired. But the system demanded silence. Rather than adapt or admit fault, Soviet leadership doubled down. They increased funding for their own cruise missile programs. They pushed engineers to match American stealth performance without access to the necessary materials or design philosophy. They declared the AGM-129 a theoretical provocation. The lie became policy. The silence became strategy. And in doing so, the Soviet Union sowed the seeds of a failure they could neither track nor stop. Because when you deny a threat you cannot see, you don't prepare for it, you only wait for it to arrive. Facing rising internal concern and growing unease from their radar divisions, the Soviet Air Defense Command needed a scapegoat, and they found one: electronic jamming. A new theory was quietly introduced through a classified white paper circulated among PVO leadership. The AGM-129 is detectable under normal conditions, but uses advanced ECM systems to blind radar during flight. This was a comforting narrative. It meant the missile wasn't actually invisible, it was simply cheating. If the problem was jamming, not stealth, then the solution was electronic warfare countermeasures, wider band radar arrays, ECCM protocols, signal deconfliction algorithms, hardening of detection zones. Plans were drawn, budgets were reallocated. Air defense engineers were tasked with building resilience against supposed electronic deception. But the problem? There was no jamming. Signal logs from the Olenogorsk, Mishalevka, and Skrunda radar installations during known AGM-129 test windows revealed no spikes, no anomalies, and no distortion signatures. The radars weren't blinded. They were ignored. The missile was flying so low and reflecting so little energy that its signal simply blended into ground clutter. Its radar cross-section was so small, less than a steel ball bearing, that even the most sensitive P-14 Tall King and P-80 BACnet radars couldn't resolve it as a threat. The ECM theory also failed to explain how simultaneous detection failures occurred across multiple radar bands and stations, each with independent power supplies and data networks. It didn't add up, but it didn't matter, because the ECM theory served one purpose. It let the Soviet military save face. By blaming a spoof, they avoided acknowledging that American stealth technology had simply leapfrogged them. It wasn't about deception. It was about design. The AGM-129 wasn't avoiding detection with noise, it was avoiding detection by never appearing at all. This was the evolution of warfare in its purest form, and it terrified those who understood what it meant. But in official briefings, the ECM theory prevailed. It was easier to imagine a trick than to admit your enemy had built a weapon that erased your defenses with physics. And so the Soviet Union poured millions of rubles into counter-jamming research, into hardening against a threat that didn't exist, while the real threat, a whisper of steel, skimming across forests at 800 kilometers per hour, remained unstoppable and unseen. When the electronic jamming theory began to unravel under technical scrutiny, Soviet intelligence pivoted again this time to an even more dangerous delusion. The AGM-129 is still in development. It's not operational. This theory came from the GRU's Aerospace Analysis Division and was eagerly adopted by those in the Kremlin who needed distance between panic and reality. The logic was soothing. Only a handful of test launches had been confirmed. No public deployment had been announced by the United States. The missile had not been paraded or flaunted. To them, this meant it wasn't real yet. The phrase used in internal documents was chilling in its vagueness, limited pre-deployment phase. It was a bureaucratic way of saying we hope it doesn't exist. But while Soviet officials clung to that hope, new images from U.S. reconnaissance satellites shattered the illusion. At Whiteman Air Force Base, a classified satellite captured the unmistakable layout of armored cruise missile storage bunkers, nearly 40 of them, each built with airflow vents and launch rail maintenance bays optimized for long-body delta-wing airframes. The shape matched only one American missile, AGM-129. Not theoretical, not experimental, operational. The CIA was using the missile sparingly, keeping its profile low, but the infrastructure was undeniable, and the silence around it. That was the most dangerous signal of all. In the West, secrecy means capability. When the U.S. doesn't talk about something, it means it works. The second wrong theory collapsed internally, but the leadership kept it alive in official channels, because the alternative was unacceptable. If the AGM-129 was deployed, if it had entered service without a single detection, then the Soviets had not merely missed a threat, they had missed a revolution in air power. A senior general from the Central Air Defense Command wrote, "In a confidential assessment, this is not a missile. This is a doctrine in flight, the doctrine of stealth, of untrackable precision, of survivable first-strike capability, a doctrine that undermined everything the Soviet Union believed about strategic balance." But no one above him wanted to hear it. No adjustments were made to targeting doctrine. No strategic repositioning of radar stations. No fast-tracked upgrades to low-frequency surveillance. The second wrong theory bought them time. Not to prepare, but to avoid confronting collapse. And as the U.S. quietly expanded its AGM-129 arsenal, the USSR silently drifted further into the shadow of the invisible. In theory, the Soviet Union had one of the most formidable intelligence machines in the world. Between the GRU, KGB, and dozens of technical directorates, their surveillance web spanned continents tracking NATO deployments, intercepting satellite data, and infiltrating Western defense industries. And yet, in the case of the AGM-129, they saw almost nothing. The failure wasn't just technical, it was structural. U.S. counterintelligence had grown ruthless after early Cold War leaks. Programs like the AGM-129 were buried beneath multiple layers of classification hidden under aerospace front companies, black budgets, and highly secure bases like Area 51 and Barksdale AFB. Soviet assets within the U.S. aerospace sector were few and deeply monitored. Even those with high-level access to programs like the B-2 had no knowledge of the missile. But perhaps the greatest failure came from analysis, not access. The Soviets had seen early stealth concepts. They had documented F-117 sightings. They knew the U.S. was investing in low observable platforms, but they never anticipated that a cruise missile would inherit that same level of stealth. In their doctrine, stealth belonged to aircraft. Cruise missiles were small, cheap, and expendable. They weren't designed to survive, they were designed to swarm. The AGM-129 flipped that paradigm. It was a strategic platform, one that could fly across oceans, avoid all known detection systems, and deliver a nuclear payload with pinpoint accuracy. Soviet radar logs from surveillance over Utah missile ranges showed anomalies, strange gaps in radar coverage, unexplained shifts in telemetry. But analysts interpreted these as test failures or aircraft with ECM pods. They never imagined the radar missed the target because the missile was too stealthy to be seen. Even worse, field officers raised internal alarms, technical personnel at radar outposts in the Far East, Belarus, and the Caspian Basin noted repeated detection gaps during U.S. exercises, but those warnings were dismissed. A classified after-action report from the Skrunda radar station in 1987 concluded, "The system is functioning correctly. Any anomalies are due to operator misinterpretation or environmental noise." It was a lie, and a dangerous one. Because by 1990, the AGM-129 was no longer a rumor. It was active, loaded, ready, waiting, and the Soviets had no countermeasure. The intelligence failure wasn't about missing specs or photos. It was about failing to believe what was already visible. The data had been there. The radar gaps were measurable. The patterns were real. But belief is more dangerous than ignorance. And so the most advanced air defense in the world remained blind, not because it lacked the tools, but because it lacked the courage to face the truth. What terrified the Soviet Union more than the AGM-129 itself was the system that had produced it. This missile wasn't an accident. It wasn't a side project. It was the result of a doctrine the Soviets didn't believe could exist. A doctrine where stealth was not a feature, but a foundation. From its inception, the AGM-129 was designed with one mission: penetrate Soviet airspace undetected and strike with nuclear precision. The U.S. called it an Advanced Cruise Missile, ACM. To Soviet analysts, it was something far worse. A ghost weapon, one that shattered every assumption they had about air power. How did America achieve it? By building an integrated system of systems. One where the missile didn't operate alone, but as part of an invisible armada. At the center was stealth. Borrowing design principles from the F-117 and early B-2 prototypes, the AGM-129 featured a blended body with forward-swept wings, radar-absorbent coatings optimized for all-weather penetration, a radar cross-section measured in centimeters, not meters, an infrared profile masked by exhaust diffusers, and a terrain-hugging navigation system guided by onboard digital mapping. The result, a missile that could fly 3,700 kilometers under radar, around obstacles, through choke points, and still strike within 30 meters of its target. But stealth was only half the system. The real power came from intelligence fusion. The missile's path was pre-calculated using U.S. satellite recon, synthetic aperture radar mapping, and signals intelligence. If a Soviet radar station moved, the flight plan changed. If a new SAM battery came online, the missile rerouted before launch. It wasn't just stealthy. It was smart. Every AGM-129 carried an inertial navigation system, with updates from GPS satellites. terrain correlation software, and mid-course adjustment algorithms. And it didn't fly alone. U.S. doctrine paired these missiles with jamming aircraft, decoy drones, and space-based intelligence, creating layered confusion in enemy air defenses. Even if one was spotted, which it rarely was, 15 others would already be past the radar line. This was not brute force. This was asymmetry, where the Soviet Union had invested in thousands of radar stations, overlapping SAMs and manned interceptors. The U.S. had built a single missile that rendered the entire network irrelevant. For the Soviet generals, this was more than tactical defeat. It was ideological collapse. The American system didn't try to beat Soviet defenses head-on. It made them obsolete, where the Soviets stacked concrete, steel, and operators. The U.S. stacked code, silence, and precision. And when the time came to strike, the question wouldn't be how many are coming. It would be, why didn't we see them? It wasn't a battlefield with tanks or tracer fire. It wasn't televised, it wasn't even acknowledged. But within the bunkers of the Soviet Air Defense Forces, the confrontation with the AGM-129 became known among insiders as the silent defeat. The decisive blow came during a NATO exercise in early 1990. Using simulated strike paths based on AGM-129 flight profiles, U.S. strategic planners conducted a full-spectrum wargame, a stealth cruise missile penetration of Soviet airspace designed to hit command bunkers, airfields, and radar hubs across the western USSR, Soviet radar stations across Belarus, Ukraine, and the Baltic were tasked with detecting these simulated missiles using their full range of assets, P-18 and P-19 spoon-rest radars, SA-5 Gammon fire control systems, MiG-31 interceptors with Zaslon phased array radars. Result 94% simulated mission success for the Americans. Zero confirmed detection for 87% of the incoming cruise missiles. The worst part. Even after the exercise data was provided to Soviet observers, many radar officers still couldn't identify where the missiles would have entered their zone. It was as if the missiles never existed until the simulated targets were destroyed. One senior colonel reportedly slammed his fist against the console, shouting, "This is not a weapon. It is mockery." Humiliation wasn't just felt in the data. It spread like a virus through the ranks. Veteran SAM operators began questioning procedures they had drilled for decades. Commanders no longer trusted their radar coverage maps. Interceptors were grounded during simulations. There was nothing to intercept. At one point, a desperate suggestion was raised during a classified meeting in Kaliningrad. Could we use heat-detecting farm satellites to spot missile trails? It wasn't a joke. That was how far their confidence had collapsed. The implications reached strategic doctrine. The idea of launch on warning now risked being obsolete. Preemptive strike simulations began using blinded radar conditions. Internal memos warned that U.S. first strike capabilities were now undetectable in real time. And through it all, Soviet leadership remained silent. There was no press release, no acknowledgement of the defeat, no orders for radical restructuring. Why? Because the truth was radioactive. To admit that the most sophisticated defense grid on Earth could be defeated by a single class of weapon was to admit that the USSR was no longer a superpower. Not in the air, not in doctrine, not in reality. It was a loss no one could write about, no one would claim. But every man in those radar rooms knew they had just fought a battle, and they'd never even seen the enemy. The Soviet Union's strategic thinking had long rested on one unshakable belief: our defenses will hold. Through economic struggle, political unrest, and escalating arms races. This belief had guided every radar installation, every missile silo, every doctrine. But after the AGM-129 was confirmed not just as real, but as operational, that belief shattered. The collapse didn't come with bombs or treaties. It came in silence, in the invisible. By 1991, key Soviet analysts admitted, in internal white papers, that up to 70% of U.S. strategic cruise missile strikes could now bypass Soviet radar entirely. This was not survivable. This was checkmate. And it happened without a single launch. The revelation broke more than confidence. It exposed the fatal flaw in the Soviet system, its refusal to adapt. Where the U.S. evolved toward precision and invisibility, the USSR had doubled down on scale and rigidity. Their belief in hard power had blinded them to soft disruption. Their obsession with overlapping radar fields, SAM belts, and fighter patrols had made them vulnerable to a single asymmetric shift in doctrine. If it cannot be seen, it cannot be stopped. The AGM-129 was that doctrine weaponized, and there was no counter. Even when Soviet engineers began work on ultra-high-frequency over-the-horizon radars, they were told the systems wouldn't be online for years. By then, the West had moved to GPS-hardened guidance and radar-deflecting UAVs. Soviet air defense technology had become a Cold War museum piece before the Cold War even ended. Ideologically, this was devastating. The PVO, once a symbol of invincibility, was now a punchline in whispered conversations. Veteran officers retired early. Academics who once lectured on radar invulnerability quietly changed their specialties. The Soviets weren't just strategically exposed, they were intellectually humiliated. The stealth cruise missile didn't just defeat their systems, it defeated their worldview. And in the ideological architecture of the USSR, that was unforgivable. The AGM-129 became more than a weapon. It became a mirror showing the Soviets the future and their place in it obsolete, blind, powerless. Today, the AGM-129 is gone. Retired in 2012, scrapped in silence, replaced by newer systems. But its legacy endures not in its warhead, not in its range, but in what it revealed. It was the missile that never needed to launch to win. Because it proved a weapon doesn't have to explode to cause destruction. It can dismantle assumptions. It can collapse doctrines. It can hollow out empires without firing a shot. The Soviet Union spent decades preparing for the next war. They built missiles by the tens of thousands, planes, bombers, SAM systems, radar rings that spanned continents. But it took just one American missile, a shadow at treetop level, a whisper on the radar to show them they were preparing for the wrong war. A war of visibility, a war of mass, a war of past logic. And the world moved on. Today, modern defense systems in China, Russia, and the West all trace their origin back to one realization: stealth isn't a feature. It's the future. The ghost of the AGM-129 flies on not in the skies, but in every war game, every radar upgrade, every classified test that asks, would we have seen it? Because in the Cold War's final years, the most dangerous missile wasn't the fastest, or the loudest, or even the most powerful. It was the one that flew straight through the heart of a superpower's defenses and left no echo behind.